Welcome, everyone. To call the meeting to order at 10:02. Anyone have any additions to the agenda? See none. Before we confirm agenda, I'd like to request a small change. I'd like to bring 6.1 forward to be our first item so that we can free staff from having to just wait here. Is that all right with everyone? Okay. We don't need a motion for that, do we? Council's in agreement?
Yeah, they agree, so then you're just going to confirm the agenda.
Okay. So with that change, we need a confirmation of agenda. Thank you. Moved by Pat, second to Scott. All in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest or the general nature thereof? Seeing none, the clerk will note that. So we're going to move to then 6.1, gateway signage proofs. Thanks, Trevor.
Okay, so from the last meeting, the recommendations from the proposed signage was the version number 3. One was to enlarge the township logo and remove Hamilton Township from the bottom. And then the other one was to just enlarge the Township of Hamilton at the bottom and make it a little more bold. So them changes have been made and the two are in front of you. One of the changes on the number 2 was they added where it says welcome to a little design on either side. I asked about having that removed, but he said that brought a big blue space to your eye, so he needed something to fill that in. So there's 2 proposals there for your discussion.
Thank you. I'll open up to council then. Pat?
First of all, thank you, Trevor, for being so patient with us as we try and switch things a bit on you. I originally was the one who thought that revised to version 3 without Hamilton Township at the bottom might be the best plan, but seeing the one with Hamilton Township at top and bottom, I think it looks really nice. So that's the one I prefer, but I'm not going to be heartbroken if we go with the other one.
Okay. Any other opinions? Yes, Larry?
I vote for version 1, or vision 1, version 3. I think that's a good solution.
It's the one that's on the screen now.
Yes.
Any opposition? I got 1 thumbs up. No, I'm okay with either as well. So if it seems we have a majority anyway who's indicating revision 1, version 3. Is that clear? I think we do. Okay. Moved by Pat, seconded by Mark. All in favor? Carried. Thanks, Trevor, for your work. And we'll back up now then to 5.1, presentation from Watson and Associates. Gary Scanlon, thank you for your patience, Gary. We bumped you down the line there a little bit, but it was fairly short and sweet. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right, perfect. Great. Pleasure to be here. So I'm going to present material similar to what we've done in prior presentations. So I'll move through relatively at a good pace, and then, but any questions as I'm going through, more than happy to answer them. So this just highlights the process we've been going through with staff. Started the process back in February, and we proceeded through to the point of releasing on May 3rd, background study. What's important about the date for release is there was changes since the last bylaw that you passed. I'll go through some of those, but Bill 73 made adjustments. And one of the things they did is made a mandatory 60-day minimum period on which this has to be circulated to the public and before you can pass the bylaw. So that's why we've highlighted here the release on May 3rd, and you can see there's the mandatory public meeting, and subsequent to that, we're here today and we've met the 60-day minimum. So that's been covered off. Development charges, they've been around for over 60 years now. They used to be called lot levies many, many years ago, if you've ever heard that term. And that's when they were passed under the Planning Act, and you could impose the charge when you created the lot. So that's where they got the term lot levy. Since, so going from the mid-1950s forward to the end of 1980, there was a lot of case law, so going to the OMB, and that's what really kind of set the methodology, the approach, the rules, the regulations. And then in 1989, they took all of that case law and they weaved it together into the Development Charges Act. And we've gone through 4 different amendments to the Act, some changes and such. And there's further changes that are on the horizon if you've seen the Bill 108 and the material that I've sent through to staff. There's further changes that'll be made to the Act over time. So right now, the development charges are to recover costs related to growth. Some of the costs are easy to see. You know, if you're building, a subdivision, it may impact on a road, so you have to do turning lanes or intersections. But as you grow, there's further things. There's going to be impact on libraries and parks and recreation and such. So it really is to take a look at the infrastructure for residential, non-residential growth. The second bullet is important in that the Act distinguishes 2 different types of cost. One cost which, for the most part, the developer pays 100% for, because that's inside the subdivision. So any internal roads, if they put street lights, if they have water and sewer, anything that's inside, that's their cost, and the Act calls that local service. Okay, I'll come back to that because there was that Bill 73 made some changes that I'll come back to, but for the most part, there's the costs that are direct to the subdivision. That's 100% the developer cost. And then the development charges normally take what's outside of the subdivision. So, intersection improvements, arenas, parkland development, those type of things are included in the DC. There were limitations. In 1997, they made a number of changes to the Act. It was first passed in '89, allowed for 100% recovery for all the services you provide. 1997, they made significant changes where you go from being able to collect 100% of the cost of growth probably down to right now 75-80% of the growth, just because of all these reductions and deductions. Some of it is they remove some of the services that you can collect for, so that basically a town hall has been removed from DCs. All of the arts and cultural sector completely removed, with the exception of library. It's the only one that's allowed to continue. Tourism facilities, economic development. We used to be able to provide grants to hospitals for expansions, because obviously the province looks to the municipality to pay a minimum of 1/3, and a lot of times it's up to about 45%. So we used to be able to collect money to throw towards it, but that's been removed. Parkland acquisition, you do have under the Planning Act the ability to acquire some land, but we used to top up. If the municipality had higher standards than what the Planning Act allowed you to collect, then we could top up. And then they put in a test there that says basically that for vehicles and equipment, it has to be significant equipment. So it has to meet this test of lasting 7 years or longer. I think some municipalities were putting weed whippers and hammers and screwdrivers and such. So they kind of said, no, it has to be significant equipment. So that's not a major one, but it's in there regardless. A very high overview of the calculations that are in here, and it's described a lot more in Chapter 4. You identify the amount, type, and location of growth. From that gives rise to being able to identify servicing needs, and which translate into capital projects. Then there's a number of deductions that we make, and we end up with a net cost. And then from that net cost, we have to split it between, is there a benefit between, what's the benefit between residential and non-residential development? And then basically divide it back by the growth to come up with the charges. So you have low, medium, high density for residential, so singles and semi-detached, townhouses, apartments, okay, so low, medium, high density. And then you have non-residential, which is normally represented on a cost per square foot basis. And then just summarizes in a very high level, what we're getting is the net cost of infrastructure, we're dividing it by the growth, and really that's what gives rise to the charge. In very, very, very simple terms, that's what we're trying to do in these calculations. As I noted, there was changes. The province in 2013 initiated a discussion process, which at the end of 2015 they implemented, and these are where they've made the changes. Minor in the first one, that they did some refinements to some of the definitions and such. They've basically asked municipalities to consider area rating, so doing area-specific charges. Normally, area-specific works well for water and sewer or storm, like sanitary, because you can measure the exact benefiting area. But other things like trying to do area-specific for parks or for an arena or something become very, very difficult. So generally, we only recommend area-specific charges if you're doing the hard services, water, wastewater, storm. Waste diversion. So in 1997, they wiped out all of the solid waste service. So landfill, incineration, recycle, reuse, completely taken away from you. What the province has added back in is waste diversion. So recycle, reuse, organics, those type of things we can now collect for. Like anything else, the province likes municipalities turning their mind to asset management. So we've dealt with that in one of the appendices to address that part of the act. For transit, there's new calculations, more difficult calculations, if you will, for you almost need engineers to help do that calc. But they made some revisions there. No additional levies is that local service policy that I talked about. Remember I said there's very localized costs, within the subdivision. So this no additional levies section basically says you have to be very clear what the developer's responsibilities are going to be. So what are the types of costs? If you were putting in, there may be all the stuff that's internal, but maybe that subdivision impacts on a collector road. So do they pay for the turning lane, or are you putting the turning lane in the development charge? What if they're doing intersections and you have to put street lights? Is that a direct cost back to the developer, or are you putting it in the DC? So in order to deal with that, there's a local service policy that's in the background study. Just to be very clear as we go through this process, these are the costs that the developers are expected to pay for. And these are the costs we've included in the DC. So there's clarity now between that. And that's what the Act wants you to do, is make it very clear so as the developers proceed, they know what the rules and the regulations are. We talked about the public process. Before, you could do it as quick as 2 weeks. You could turn around, release the background study, have the public meeting, and pass the bylaw within 2 weeks. Now you have a minimum 60-day period. So, and then lastly, there's just some enhancements to what the treasurer reports on the reserve funds, and really it's just enhanced transparency, just to be a little clearer and stuff. So not significant, but some changes have impacted on, certain municipalities. So with yourself, we need a resolution on, we've discussed the no additional levies as part of this background study, the annual reporting, the treasurer's been doing a good job in that. We've met the 60 days, and then you need a resolution on area rating. Basically, all of your charges are imposed on the township wide. So it's just to confirm that. I've talked about the local service policy. I won't go through in a lot of detail, but it covers items such as, well, what if that subdivision is adjacent to a collector road or an arterial road? What are their responsibilities for intersections? If you're going to put trails or bike paths or such, where does their responsibility start and end? Those type of things. There are exemptions that are discussed within the Act. Some of them are mandatory, not a lot, but there are some mandatory ones. So the mandatory ones are if you have an existing industrial building, 100,000 square feet, they can add another 50% without having to pay the development charge. So they can go from 100,000 to 150,000, not have to pay the charge. If they go to 175,000, then they'd only pay for that 25,000 that's in excess of the 50%. And then if you've got an existing house, a single-family home, you can add 2 additional apartments, as long as you don't more than double the size of the original house. And then for medium and high density, you can add 1 additional unit. And then the last one just says that if you pass your bylaw, you cannot impose the charges on the schools, the school board, or the upper tier. So you can't charge the county for any of their buildings. But if they have bylaws, because they're allowed both to have bylaws as well, if you construct a building, they won't impose the charges on you. So it's kind of a quid pro quo. I don't charge you, you don't charge me type of thing. That's those are the mandatory ones. Not many, but they're there. Then there's the second part where the Act says you as a council can fine-tune the bylaw and put in any types of additional exemptions that you feel are appropriate. You can reduce the charge in those cases, or completely, or just reduce it by 25% or 50%. And you can do that either by class. So let's say industrial, I want to reduce it by 50%. Or maybe for places of worship, a type, I want to exempt them completely. That's your prerogative. We just have to put it into the bylaw so it's very clear when we charge and when we don't. In some instances, if the charge is going up considerably, you may wish to phase it in over time. So if you're going up by a couple $1,000s, maybe you might want to go $1,000 a year. Those are things you can do as part of your policies. And then the last one talks about a redevelopment credit, and basically it means that if my house burns down or I knock it down and I'm going to replace it, I should have a period of time to replace it without having the charge imposed. And probably 95% of municipalities in Ontario use 4 or 5 years as that time horizon. So you knock down your house, you got 5 years to replace it. Okay? If you're going to do it 15 or 20 years later, too bad, is generally the rules. If it's open-ended, and that initially there was a court case that didn't narrow it, we had people coming and, with pictures from the 1800s, a little house on the prairie house, and saying, oh, I should get an exemption because, see, there was a house there at some point. So we've gone back through the OMB hearings to tighten that type of situation down. So with your exemptions, places of worship are exempted. As well with cemeteries, churchyards, and such. So if you're exempt from taxation, then those would be exempted. There are solar panels and wind turbines of less than certain size. They won't be charged, but if they're significant, they're the big windmills and stuff like that, you'll pay. But if it's a smaller one for your house, you wouldn't pay for that type of thing. And telecommunication towers. So those are the ones that you have right now, and further ones, if you wanted to consider, they could be added. Okay, it's fairly straightforward. It's your bylaw to define the policies. As we move forward, you as a council have decisions that are to be made. as we grow, there's always costs that are activated. You may not see it like one house, but at the end of 10 years, if you've issued 100 building permits a year, now you got 1,000 houses and 3,000 people, it activates more services and more needs. So as that growth occurs, and that's what the top oval talks about, it'll give rise to infrastructure needs. And there's no magic, because you have to pay for infrastructure. You either pay for it fully off of property taxes, or you recover what you can off of the development charges. Remember, development charges aren't necessarily 100% cost recovery, but they make a significant contribution towards those projects. So that's the balance that you need to. It's not mandatory you have a bylaw, but if you don't have the bylaw, then all of those costs go on to the existing taxpayer. So it's you to make the balance in your policies. The growth forecast that's included is summarized here. You can see historic levels of building are in the black, with the red line giving you your average, and you can see we expect some level of increase over time. The economy is doing well. There's more development that's been occurring, certainly well outside the GTA, with better transportation and such. So though that growth forecast over 10 years translates into about 350 units and about 420 people, over the longer term it's about 800 units and about 1,300 people. And you can see there's square footage, non-residential square footage that's been provided for. Your current rates right now are $6,100 for all residential units. You've got charges that are there for those solar towers, the telecommunication towers, wind turbines, and you have a non-residential square footage. These haven't been indexed, so that, like anything else, 5 years later, the cost of doing work has increased with inflation. So if you haven't been indexing it, it's basically back in 2014 dollars. So that those are, when we're doing the comparison, you probably want to keep that in mind. So that we've made a couple of adjustments. We released an addendum, and it was really just to include the DC category for, if you look here, that middle column, the solar telecommunications and such, we've added that back in. And as well, because of Bill 108, there's going to be some changes. So all we've done is for the growth-related studies, we've broke them into two categories. And I'll come back to Section 108 shortly, and then you'll see why we've split it. These services are basically the same as what you had last time, with the exception of police services. We haven't included that at this time, as no capital has been identified. So the calculated charge for a single detached is just under $6,200. We've also stratified the charge by different types of housing units. The medium density, which is called other multiples, if you get kind of like a townhouse complex, then we've at least provided it. But probably the one that's more important is the apartments. We can see apartments in houses. We can see apartments being built over stores and such. So we wanted to ensure that we had proper charges for that. And you can see that a two-bedroom apartment's being provided at about $3,600, and a one-bedroom's at $2,700. We've measured all of these based on the average number of people that are in those type of houses, okay, those type of buildings. We have very specialized information from StatsCan that lets us know what the number of people are in those, the average in those different types of housing units. And that's what we've used to differentiate it. You can see we have the solar charges at $4,800, and then the non-residential has been calculated at about $4.47. You can see roads is the most significant portion of that, in at $3. Just to compare the charges from current, versus today, you can see that current bylaws at $6,100 unindexed, and the calculated one is at just under $6,200. So it's not a significant increase. It's basically a reaffirmation of the charges that you have in place right now. On the non-residential side right now, though, there's a significant jump in the charges, going from 63 cents to $4.47. So that's something you may wish to consider, whether to phase that in, put it in immediately, or do some type of refinement to that number. But we'll give you, just the last couple of slides, just give you a comparison of your municipality relative to others that are on the 401 series highways. The lower tier is in the light gray. None of these municipalities have upper tier charges, but some of them do have education charges in place, and that's what the dark blue is. So you can see that right now your charges are at the lower end of the scale. The $6,200 is basically at the right side. You can see in Kingston, for example, they've got charges at about $22,500. Going the other way, as you get closer to the GTA, you start to see the charges go up even higher than $22,000. For commercial, you can see where you are currently, and comparing yourself to those municipalities, the new charges basically put you in and around other municipalities such as Belleville or Quint West. And then when we take a look at industrial, similar type of occurrence, you're in there in about the charge for Quint West or Brighton. Last thing I'll touch on is we've calculated this based on the act that's in place today. You're probably aware that province has been making changes. They put out Bill 108, which actually is dealing with 15 changes to 15 different pieces of legislation. Development charges is one of them, Planning Act. LPAT has been changed back to, I think, to where they were before, etc. So what they'll be looking to do in very simple terms is to take the soft services, and they'll want to take them out of the development charge bylaw, and they want to put them into a new charge called the Community Benefit Charge, CBC. That'll be under the Planning Act. And what they want to do is they want to take the charges that you impose for cash in lieu, plus those soft services, and they want to put them together. And then they want to charge that as a percentage of the value of the lot. Okay, the value of the lot the day before building permit will be the basis for that calculation. We're just getting details out. They said that they released regulations. To me, regulations are more directive or prescriptive. This is more narrative, so it's kind of a nice chat type of document. They are going through a process, and they would expect to have the regulations in force at some point in the fall. Probably, they're not sitting until towards the end of October, so we won't see new regulations until then. So the changes that they've made is the soft services. They've will require payments in installments for certain types of developments. If you have if you have rental housing, or you have commercial, industrial, institutional, they will pay in 6 installments. Okay, so over time in 6 payments. You can add interest. At this particular point, it doesn't appear there's any restrictions on what rate of interest you use. But for nonprofit housing, they'll require payments over 21 years, okay, which is extensive. But, so the treasurer has to set up a mechanism for monitoring that if you get that type of housing. And then for certain, normally the development charge is calculated at the time of building permit. What they will be doing for if you come through site plan or you come through a zoning application, the quantum of the charge will be locked in the day of the application. okay? And then once that zoning approval is there or the site plan is approved, they got 2 years to basically pull a building permit, or they go back to whatever the current rate is. So you've got that kind of, on average, it's probably like 3 or 4 years they'll lock in the rates for. And that's part of what they want to do. On the other side, as I've noted, they're taking those soft services and they're putting it under the Planning Act. They will basically, for the most part, that charge is, as I've described, is going to be as a percentage of the lot. So we're going to have to, and there's some additional rules and regulations we expect to see. So there'll be more coming. And the implementation date is you will have until January 1, 2021 to conform to that. As of that date, the soft services in the bylaw that you would pass, they will die. And you have the opportunity to replace it in a new CBC bylaw. Okay, so you've got basically from this point a year and a half. And that's what this is describing, is that, May 2nd is when they introduced Bill 108. That's the green. The red circle indicates the day that they gave it royal assent, which is June 6th. What's important in the bylaw, in the legislation, is they've said some of the legislation related to the development charge is in force upon royal assent. But there's provisions in there that say other parts of the act comes into play upon proclamation. We don't have proclamation until the fall, probably November. So we're in that kind of period right now, and that's why that nebulous blue area or dark gray kind of has an unknown, because we're not quite sure when the time horizon is, other than while they're talking about draft proclamation being effective for January 1st, but that's not confirmed until they pass the regulation. But then you've got until 2021 basically to adjust this bylaw. So it just means those softer services get pulled out and we go under a new regime. And if I just go back a couple of slides just to summarize that for you, there you go. So you can see where you've got your outdoor, indoor library. So you've got roughly about $600 is what we're talking about being pulled out. And you can see the studies. We've called it engineering and community-based. In that community-based, that's where you've got things like you can pay for official plans or parks and recreation master plans. Those studies will drop out and they have to go under the CBC as well. Okay? So I just wanted to point out the services related to a highway, so roads will continue, fire protection will continue, and general government engineering will stay in this development charge bylaw. The other services will have to go into that other provision. And so the last slide just says, I'm here to help you with any adjustments to the bylaw that you want, and we'd be looking to pass it today.
Thank you.
Back to you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll open it up to council members then for discussion or questions. Yes, Pat, again?
I have a number of questions. First of all, when you looked at this was over a 10 period, you're looking 10 years forward in terms of sort of capital buildings and those kind of things. Am I right in thinking that?
For roads and fire, we've looked over a longer, like 20 years.
Okay.
For the softer services, we've looked over 10.
Okay, so the soft services I'm most curious about, and I know that that's the one that's sort of a little bit more up in the air because of the CBC thing. One is that I know that there is no plan intent, either on the township or the library's end, for a new building. So I wasn't surprised to see that the library amount was reduced. I am concerned that if I did my math correctly, it's reduced by close to 80%. We went from 287 to 62.
Right.
And it concerns me for a couple of things. One is if the new CBC thing that they're bringing in is in any way ends up being based on what percentage you're paying now for your development charges, having that big of a reduction prior to them committing how they're going to do the CBC could work out to a true disadvantage for us. And the library doesn't just count buildings for its growth, it also counts collection.
That's correct.
And, I mean, books are very expensive. So I'm looking and going, is that too big of a cut for library services when we don't know the potential of its impact in the future? And I would say the same thing to a lesser degree for the outdoor and indoor recreation, because it's where did I figure it out? I did the math somewhere. 30% decrease? And again, if we end up with a new system that is in any way based on our current rates, and we don't know what it's going to look like, is making that big of a decrease now a disadvantage for us in the future?
Oh, very good question. Number one, part of what we have to do as part of the DC study is take a look at the level of service. So they define what do you have in place today? And we looked at the buildings, the square footage, the replacement cost of those buildings, plus we looked at all the materials. How much collection you have. Excuse me. When we worked through the calculations, the maximum we could collect is $29,000 of both buildings and the collection materials. So that's I'm not quite sure how the approach was undertaken the last time, but the maximum that you can collect would be just under $30,000.
Could I clarify, because I think
Yeah.
I know where that figure came from, maybe. Is that figuring out our estimated rate of growth based with our charge?
It's looking, the 25, we've included, what it says is over the next 10 years, based on the calculation, so we're compelled to do a service calculation. Look backwards 10 years, look at quality and quantity, divide it by the amount of people and stuff, and do this math calc. That math calculation translates into just under $30,000. What we've included in the DC is $25,000. So we could increase the charge by perhaps another 20%. So if you and that would be easy enough to do because it's justified. So if we wanted to increase it, but to increase it past that, I wouldn't be able to advise you to do that.
Okay, is my thinking potentially correct that if we just leave it very low, not knowing how the CBC is going to be set up, that it could impact us much longer term than we were anticipating?
Maybe, maybe not. I'm not clear enough right now.
So-
What it says is there'll be a maximum amount you could collect. And it says that you can allocate that towards certain services. But it doesn't right now talk about the restrictions that are currently under the Development Charges Act. So if you choose not to have, I'm not going to do any more arenas, but I think I'm going to need to build a new library, you may be able to take that money and say, okay, I'm not doing recreation, but I'm going to throw it towards the library. I can't
That's a scary
definitively
thought.
tell you that right now because until we get through with the new regulations, I'm not quite sure. I would think right now, because they're silent on it, you might be able to do that, but I'm not quite sure.
Okay. I would like to see library services go up a little bit. And if it can't, I mean, even if not the 20%, at least enough that I feel like because you say it maybe, maybe not, I'd like to make sure that we're looking after the maybe. That
Right.
Maybe it will be directly impacted. And I feel like that might be the same thing for recreation services, that we're taking a chance of losing money in the future. The other question I have, which I don't know if is a question, is not directly related to your presentation, but in the bylaw, when it talks about library,
Yes.
obviously something near and dear to my heart, it exempts computers. And my question is that a, because it says you can do collections, it says you can do building, but it exempts computers. Is that a legislated thing, or is that something that we have potential to change in terms of computers for use of patrons, not for office use?
You, the act originally said that computers are not eligible as a capital cost. There have been hearings that have basically said, well, if it's integral to the provision of the service, then you can include it. So the computers that are out on the front, instead of having those long, card drawers anymore, you're using computers. So the ones that are out in the front, they are eligible.
Oh.
The ones that are in the back room, like an administrative staff, the librarian, they're not eligible.
Okay, so the way ours reads right now that says computers exempt would still intend,
It would still be fine.
okay, and I think my last question is, if you look at sort of a 10-year picture, or you said sometimes like with fire and such, a longer term, and the percentage that the charges is relatively small to start with, again, like library. If at some point further down the line, a building lasts a lot more than 10 years, you need to replace the building, do they, I'm sorry, I'm
Can
trying
I
to get my
put
wording
money
correct.
towards replacing that building? Is that the
Like,
question?
if it's a 10-year impact, and the stuff from more than 10 years back that's been put aside still can go towards that building, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So we
But-
haven't deducted, any money you've got in the reserve stays in it, and what we're doing is adding to that reserve fund.
So, if money that you've taken out to use for collections doesn't mean that you're,
You're not restricted.
okay, I'm just gonna go with that, because I don't think I'm
Yeah.
wording it well, but I think you're answering my question.
That's where one of the resolutions we asked you to pass is that council approve the capital list in principle, subject to the annual review during the capital budget process. That allows you, as long as it meets the test of being growth-related, expanding the service, then you can pay for it. So if you didn't want to use it for collections, but you wanted to add another room, like add, 1,000 square foot extension on the building, use it for the 1,000 square foot extension.
Okay, I think you answered my question, but I figured out how to word it so you would know what I was referring to. 20 years from now, we want to build a new fire station.
Yep.
The people who paid development charges 20 years ago, where we still have some of the money sitting because we've been using it for smaller things, would now be, well, this is not new development because I've been here 20 years, but because that money was collected, then it can still be used for.
That's right.
Thank you.
And we would, in the calculations, we'd recognize any money in the reserve as being an existing benefit. Remember I said there's those different deductions? One of the things is existing benefit. So, but really it's those existing people right now have paid into the reserve, so the money's there in the reserve. We'll use that. So they've made their contribution. So, but we, in the sheets, we show it as existing benefit because those people exist today.
Okay.
It's terminology, but
I
it's fine.
do realize I have one more, sorry. The CBC has to be, our CBC bylaw has to be in place by January 1st, 2021.
Correct.
If they get it finalized in the fall, we still have that full year where we can be collecting for the soft
Absolutely.
services if we haven't put a new bylaw in place. Am I correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, right now, we can pass the new development charge bylaw with all the services. The province says you can either keep going with your existing bylaw for those soft services or implement the new ones. The problem is with having two different bylaws is you may have different exemptions, you may have different policies, then the two of them are out of whack. So, but you can pass the new bylaw right now with the updated rates.
Thank you.
Okay, Pat? Anybody else on council? Yes, Scott?
Thank you, Mayor. I have several questions. Hopefully I can continue through them in somewhat of a logical order. The document fascinates me, by the way. And I have a version here that's has various page numbers on it, and I'll refer to them to start off with. On page G10, section 4.1, development is giving us that section is giving us an area of applicable lands that development charges can be applied to. Obviously, development is for residential, commercial, industrial, institutional. When I take that information and I go back to section 4A on page G9, and that section, by the way, is dealing with the 50% enlargement. It's specific dealing with industrial buildings.
Correct.
The commercial are not eligible for a 50% increase.
That's part of the mandatory exemptions that I spoke of. The Act makes a mandatory exemption for the 50% for existing industrial buildings.
And nothing more.
That's the mandatory.
Okay.
If you wanted to mirror it for other, like commercial or institutional, that's the discretionary exemption you could consider.
Very well. Staying with the industrial reduction, and I've gone back to read the definition of existing building, existing industrial building. And I think that's where my answer lies. But obviously there's an intent, or we would have a desire, that it's a one-time 50% increase.
Yes.
In other words, if we had an existing building of 20,000 square feet, we could get a free building permit on development charge end of things to get it to 30,000 square feet.
Correct.
That's a one-time permit.
Correct.
However, we wouldn't be able to come back at a later date and increase 30 to 45
Correct.
without paying development charges.
That's correct.
Okay,
And that, just for your information, that has been as a result of going to the OMB. One of the cases has clarified that the intent is a one-time expansion. Once again, if you want to change that and let it keep going in perpetuity, that's something you could exempt as a discretionary exemption.
I'm tempted to go more towards the other direction of wanting a development charge rather than not. I'm questioning then, based on that theory, and that was my own conclusion as well, I'm questioning the tightness of the definition in the section 12 of definitions, which says existing industrial building means a building used or in a connection with. And then it describes several. And it goes on to section E, where it says the building is existing as of the date of its first building permit. So does that mean the day before its first building permit or the day after its first building permit? And if you apply that to my 20, 30, and 45, there's a little bit of ambiguity there. Would we not be better off if we said on the date and the passing of the bylaw for the words existing industrial building?
This is, for the most part, in the regulation, this definition. So it's, but I'd have to double check on E, whether that's in the regulation or not. The rest of it is exactly as it is in the regulation. But the intent here is it's as of the building permit.
As of
The first,
after the first
it's,
building
it's,
permit?
it's, and we distinguish because you could have 4 or 5 different building permits, right? You can have a foundation permit, and then you can have all these different permits. So it's the first one that's pulled. That's the trigger date. We look backwards from there to see whether there was a building or not. And if the building permit is pulled on July 4th, you go back 5 years and, you go you go backwards to take a look and see whether that, there was any other expansions and such, and if there have been, then basically they've used up the credit, right?
Why are you using 5 years in
Oh,
that response?
I just use that as an example.
Okay,
But you go backwards, right, to see if they've had the expansion credit.
right. Assuming there to be none,
Yep,
I don't want it to be used again,
right,
right?
right.
And like I say, I'm not so sure that that doesn't need to be clarified a little bit in that definition.
Okay.
The other component I have, and it's my favorite one, by the way, and I'm sure my fellow council members and staff are going to know I'm going to talk about communication towers and the other two that fall into that category. I go to section 4.1 again, applicable lands. And one thing I need to be able to collect a development charge, of course, is the appropriate applicable land, and I need development of that land, which will include the need for services. Then the keyword "and." And I need one of the next, I think it's 7, ending in building permit. Then it goes on to a larger section dealing with local services. In my example, I have a 200-foot or 70-meter communication tower. Under the current writing of this bylaw, how do I get to my development charge that I want to collect? I can get to A because I could say it's an increase for service.
Right.
But I can't use B 1 through 7, and I need to use one of those to qualify the word "and." So my question is, how do I collect a development charge on a 200-foot tower?
Well, quite often there's a, through you, Mr. Mayor, quite often there's a permit that's issued for the foundation. So, because they have to erect the base, so that would be one of the triggers. As well, if they're on agricultural land, they need to have some type of planning approval in order to allow for that tower to be constructed. So these 6 different items, which include a building permit, are the different triggers that are defined in the Act. So that I would perceive that one of these triggers would be activated in that process. If I'm coming forth for a tower and I'm on agricultural land, I need some type of planning approval to allow for that. And as I say, at a minimum, there's got to be a foundation permit. Somebody has to inspect. If you're going to erect a 150-foot tower, somebody has to inspect at a minimum, the base on which that's being erected.
I wish I could turn this part of your response over to our staff, because I think we'd get very different opinions on that under the Building Code Act and under the Planning Act. And I think we would find that neither is the case at this point in time.
Okay,
I think we need another trigger point there.
all right. And
Whether we have another legal trigger point to use, I don't know.
these are, as I say, Section 4.1's extracted directly from the Act. So that's what's in here.
So we can't tweak it.
Well, the way it's worded is the development of the land and these other trigger points. So normally you have to go through those trigger points. But I'm perplexed that a development wouldn't go through one of those triggers. If it's something such as the province building something, they don't have to pull a building permit. But if, Bell or, I don't know, Gary's Electrical Services want to erect my own towers, I would think I have to go through a series of municipal approvals and permits in order to achieve that. But I'm not sure if there's something that that has been brought up that I'm missing. I'd be happy to consider that. And I'll put it this way: if we need further, if we need to pursue this further, you don't have to pass the bylaw because your other one's going to expire. we can make an amendment quite easily within a year to, if there's something that we can further put in, that's fine, we can do that. All we need to do is, basically, a staff report can stand as a background study. We just have to go through that 60-day period, have a public meeting as part of it, and then pass the bylaw. So it's very easy to tweak it. If we haven't got the exact answers today, pass the bylaw, and we can advise staff how you can go through that process. But I'm not taking away what you're saying, I just haven't experienced it as being a problem, and maybe in this, there's certain things that are happening here in the municipality that we've missed. So I'm happy to address it.
I am strongly of the belief to the point where I think it needs to be reviewed.
Okay.
The other component I have, although when I answered a question here a moment ago, I closed my book up, so forgive me for a second.
Can I interrupt one
Yes, sorry, go ahead, Arthur.
through you, Mayor Kane, just to address the question that Councillor Gibb, Deputy Mayor Gibb is raising. This be a question through to Harry Scanlon, and that is, in addition to the two ways we were wondering about addressing the concern. Unfortunately, my microphone's not working, so I'll just yell a little louder. And that is, in addition to the points that are raised, which come from the legislation 1 through 7, which again Deputy Mayor Gibbs referred to, is it possible for us to either add a clause which would read something along the lines of adding the issuance or the approval of a site plan agreement under the Planning Act or any other permit that may be required by the municipality? That would, for example, include an entrance permit for a property. And this would be over and above the criteria that are identified by you from the legislation. Alternatively, if we don't add that provision, what you've written or what you've written designed into the bylaw is on page G13, and it says under 11.3, I'll let you turn to that page again on G14, and it's clause 11.3. Notwithstanding subsections 1 and 2, an owner may enter an agreement with the municipality to provide for the full payment or payment in full of a development charge before a building permit issuance or later than the issuance of a building permit. Is there any provision in us to be able to have an agreement with them to basically say, you're building this, there may not be the trigger point of a consent or zoning, but we have an agreement and you'll pay that building permit subject to that agreement and that provision in this bylaw? So those were two options running. One would be adding a provision that's over and above what you've specified comes or is extracted from the legislation, but is one that we have experience with in our township. We have a site plan agreement, or we have road access or entrance permits that are required as part of a development. Or alternatively, the way it's designed to collect it, can we use that would the owner and us, or the owner and the municipality, enter an agreement to provide for the payment?
Well, certainly the second one, for sure. If you have an agreement, you have an agreement. The first one, I just, we're now stepping into lawyer
Right.
type of stuff. What's in here is exactly what's in the act. Are your powers limited to adding additional provisions? If you never ask, you never receive. So, adding it in there is, I don't see a problem with it. If somebody contests it, then we'd figure out whether there's a problem or not.
So through you,
I can't go further than that, because now we need
Yes.
a lawyer to give a
So
little bit more insight.
if I can just sort of build on that one comment, and that is, I have written also up a provision which might help us on your observation, which I would agree with, and that is, we would add in a provision at the end, which is basically, short form of it is basically a severability provision. So we would say something like, a decision of the court stating that one or more of the provisions of this bylaw are invalid, in whole or in part, doesn't affect the validity, effectiveness, or forcibility of any of the provisions or parts of this bylaw. And I have a paper copy printed out.
I'm fine with that. I've read it.
So what that would do with is, if we put this provision in we found for some reason it is not to be one that we could use. We have to use another tool such as the agreement. We at least have the ability to have the bylaw stand and it doesn't affect the rest of the provisions in the bylaw. Would that be a fair observation?
I think that's fair.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah, and in general course, just a lot of bylaws don't have that because going through LPAT or the OMB, normally the board chairman directs the adjustment to the bylaw. So what they normally do is they direct the bylaw to be modified. They don't strike down. So that's why you normally don't see that provision. But adding that provision just adds extra lock it down. I'm 100% fine with that.
Thank you, thank you.
Anyone else?
I'm
You still on a roll,
I'm
Scott?
still rolling over here, if it's all right. Gary, in your verbal presentation, you said something I very much liked, and I'm going back to a written section in the bylaw, and I'm not so sure it's so clear for me in the bylaw as it was when you stated it. And it's dealing with that example of the house destroyed by fire, up to 5 years, no development charge.
Right.
And where I've gone in the bylaw is page G13, under development charge redevelopment credits, bullet point 2, where it says a credit in respect of any demolition under this section shall not be given unless a building permit has been issued or a subdivision has been entered into. Is that the section that's really trying to say that no development fee if you have a house burnt within 5 years and you're back building it again? Because I don't understand the wording on this bullet point 2, by the way, unless that's what it's trying to say. And if you go, that's it, Scott, I'm going to say, gosh, it could have been written a lot clearer.
So on G12?
I'm on G13. Development charge redevelopment, section 10, bracket 2 is where I am for
Okay, 10-2.
fire destroyed structure. It's the closest I can get, but I'm not so sure that's really clear there. By the way, I'll quickly add, Gary, I like what you verbalized. I
Yeah.
want that in the bylaw.
And that's-
I'm just not sure that that's what that says there.
So 2 says, a credit in respect of any demolition under this section. So anything in 10-1, 2, and 3, anything that occurs in that, it'll only be given if you're within the 5-year window.
Okay, so then can I say, can I rely on 2? Because one is dealing with conversions and different things like that exclusively.
Right?
3, again, doesn't deal with the fire destroyed house.
No.
I want a section here that's very clear that says, if we have a fire destroyed structure and you're back at building it 5 months or 5 years later, no development fees. Is 2 do that for me? And if
Well-
it does, it's not clear, as I said before.
So I guess your example with the fire is the fire stand in the words demolition?
And when we use that, assuming we do that, which I have to get to here,
Right?
is this clear enough to know that that's what that means?
Well, I'll flip it around another way. If we just use the word fire, is that clear enough? Because what is a fire? If I have, a fire that doesn't demolish the building,
Just smoke damage or water.
yeah, certain types of damage, I'd be doing repairs, and I may need a building permit, but I'm not demolishing the structure.
And you're not gonna pay a development fee, at least we don't want you
Right,
to.
right, if you're not demolishing the structure. So the key word here is demolition. And then from the demolition date moving forward is when the time horizon. But I guess you're saying, well, the fire may have occurred a year ago. The fire marshal took a year to do their stuff, so you're not.
And/or insurance, Gary.
Yep, and so we're demolishing it this year. Does the 5 years start last year when the fire occurred, or this year when the actual demolition occurred?
And do I get full credit for it all?
And you would get a credit from date of demolition.
For full credit.
Yeah. Now,
And you read that into that paragraph too?
its demolition is, because the fire is the difficult, like, we have to have something to identify that the structure is no longer there. So how does the structure no longer there occur?
Sometimes it's a 357 because the fire is all
The
encompassing.
first part talks about conversions, because if you're gonna go from a knockdown, well, you're gonna take a school and now you're gonna build apartments. It's a conversion.
Yep.
So that's what the first part talks about. The second part is trying to deal now with, if removal of a structure and putting a structure back up. And I guess the words are here, demolition. If you want to put something else in there, it has to come back to the trigger, like it has to come back to a trigger point. You could, if you want to shorten it, you could say, well, I'll tell you what, let's just go 4 years or let's go 3 years. You could. I've seen these provisions be as small as 2 years. But the norm, as I say, is either 4 or 5 years, 95% of the municipalities. But the trigger has to be, we need something to say that structure is no longer there. Because we don't want to get into whether there's a fire, but I'm getting a building permit to do interior renovations, but I'm still keeping the same structure. Then you wouldn't be initiating that provision, right?
Can you understand my concern on
I understand.
clarity of this point?
I understand the timing, like if the fire takes down the whole structure, I think your question is it the date of the fire, or is it the date after the fire marshal
Well, or-
declares it and it is demolished?
That is one component of the question. The other component is this section clear enough for staff moving into the future for the next 5 years with this bylaw, being able to say quite openly, you were destroyed by fire, you may or may not have had a demolition permit, it's 5 years or under, you don't pay any development charges. Is that section clear enough for staff to rely on?
We could add more words to that one, if that assists. I just will have to be very careful on what situations we define. Because you're right, maybe there wasn't a demolition permit, and so what's the trigger date?
I've also,
But you see, the demolition doesn't say that you have to have a demolition permit. So there is some flexibility in there. It's what does the word demolition? If you want to, what I would suggest is not touching that clause, what I'd probably suggest is that we do something as a definition of what is demolition. Demolition may be the issuance of a demolition permit, or in instances where a building is destroyed by natural causes, fire, etc., it may also be deemed a demolition. Wording like that would probably give you further definition. So I wouldn't modify this. What I would suggest is adding a clause to, or a definition of what demolition means.
that bullet point two, though, actually does reference back to a demolition permit. It references a building permit, and a demolition permit is, in fact, a building permit for specific use.
The bottom line says,
A credit in respect of any demolition under this section should not be given unless a building permit has been issued or subdivision has been entered into with the municipality within 5 years from the date, the demolition permit was issued. Well, maybe what we do is the demolition has occurred, and then we'll put in a definition of what demolition means to address your situation, because perhaps there are instances where a demolition permit isn't, and I respect that. Natural causes, fires and such. So maybe what we do is modify that to say, 5 years from the date the demolition occurred. And then we put it in the definition of what a demolition is. Demolition is either, by issuance of a demolition permit, or, the destruction of a building through fire, natural causes, et cetera. Something along that line? Would that address it?
You're the one that's wording it, I'm the only one reading it.
Well, that's a valid point. I think I think that's the way that if we're going to lock it down, I would probably suggest doing it that way.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I have 3 more questions.
Before you,
Okay, so far?
before you leave this, could I bump in? Because our clerk's brought up couple of very good points about demolition. What about a derelict building, like say an old cottage that's been uninhabited for 12 years or something, and then they decide to tear it down?
That's a gray area. Unfortunately, it's a gray area,
How
because
do
the
we fix
structure is, unless the structure's been declared derelict, so, but if it's still there, once again, what's derelict? Is it, do you need to take the whole structure down? Or is there components of it? It's derelict because some of the entranceways or the decking is infested. Unsafe.
We've all had situations where our fire department has been involved with actually burning down an old building. They're basically, the property owner works out an agreement with our fire service that building can be used for fire practice for a number of days or weeks, or even sometimes a couple of months. And then in return for having used the building, the fire department does an organized, safe burn of the house. That's another one you're going to tell me is a gray area.
Yes, absolutely.
So do we cover this somehow with amendments, or they keep using the word tweaking this bylaw? Do we need to put something in there?
I know with the derelict that is a bumpy area. I'll use the economic term, bumpy, because it's, once again, there's still a structure there. And, there's got to be some guidance as to whether it's what derelict means and whether it's uninhabitable or, whatever. I don't know. That's a gray area. I know it has been with municipalities.
So you're telling us we can't cover this in our
Well, I
bylaw?
think perhaps it's, included in the definition of demolition, that it would include derelict buildings, but or however, and then it comes back to, you have to find what a definition of derelict means.
Yeah, I know you have a question. Is this on this exact topic, Pat? Yes, okay.
I actually need some clarification because I thought I completely understood the conversation and then I got lost. So, a derelict building, uninhabitable derelict building, by whatever definition you use, you would say if it was rebuilt, it should have development charges on it because that's essentially new. I just want to make sure I understand the conversation correctly.
That's what we're trying to lock down, is that if it's been derelict, uninhabitably derelict for 10 years, then you're past the 5-year test.
Okay, so that timeline falls from there.
And I'm suggesting what we do is we address it. Going to the board always takes a look at, if you have more words, it gives better insight. So if we take that definition and add a number of items to it, then at a minimum, the board turns their mind to that definition. Now, I'm not saying that it wouldn't be subject to somebody challenging it. Because, once again, I've read all 150 OMB cases. I don't remember one that deals with that specifically. So I don't know. I can't answer it because it hasn't been tested, and I'm not a lawyer, okay? Sometimes they go to the Supreme Court decisions and stuff. I don't have that ability. So you're asking me to move outside my comfort level. I can express what I've read in all 150 OMB cases, but I can't past that, I can't give you insights.
But within the way this is written now, our logic would be that 5-year window, looking
Yes,
back.
yes. And I think the more words to it, the better you are to go to the board, OMB or the LPAT.
Okay, I'm back with the group now, thank you.
All right, I'm sorry, Scott, to butt in
Oh.
there, but just wanted to clarify that, or try to clarify it, or see what we do about it. so.
No, it was actually one of my questions, so all good.
Oh, sorry.
I don't get credit for having to take up so much time then. I'll shorten it up a little bit, Gary. I'm actually turning to the chart of current being based on the 2014 document and the proposed new document. And it's a chart that I've gotten from your presentation, or the presentation for the open house. And based on an overall total, our residential development charge is basically going up $84. Insignificant.
Correct.
But within the breakdown of those charges, there's one that's amazing to me, and I'm really questioning how it could go down to the extent that it is. And under the current document, in 2014, the Fire Protection Service has an allotment of $692. And in the future document, it has a fee of $490, down $200. Now, in recent years, our fire department has been expanding in staff, in equipment, in expensive trucks.
Budget.
In budget, like, I mean, everything in that fire department is going up. I'm not speaking negatively of that, other than the fact that I don't know how a development charge could go down, considering that everything we see in that fire department going up. And one of the items that sticks in my mind, and I'll just generalize it, in the last 3 years, we have basically spent $1.25 million on 2 trucks, totaling that $1.25 million. So I'm having a hard job understanding that that's actually fact in there, Gary.
Took my question out.
That's a fair question. What projects we have in there was identified is a new station, but it's replacing the Harwood and the Boodley stations. So when I take a look at the potential sizing of it versus what it's replacing, it's a marginal increase in size. So we were looking at size as kind of being the measure. And then we made a provision for an additional vehicle. So what we have, the charge is based on recovering about $500,000, but we could collect up to $1.5 million. So this particular one could actually triple from what you have currently. But it's based on the projects that were identified when we met with staff. So there's some limitation, but we could enhance it by, as I say, we could probably basically triple the amount of the charge, if that was the direction of council.
If I were to comment on the buildings, our new single building, which has, in my mind, yet to be considered anywhere other than in personal conversation, and I've had those personal conversations as well, our single new building will cost substantially more, like 8-10 times the cost of the 2 existing buildings.
Yes.
And I base that on a little history of the 2 buildings that's there now, and I also base that on a little history of the new type of building that fire halls seem to be being constructed under. So I question that, Gary, as to whether we should be looking at that differently than we are.
Well, as I say, what through you, Mr. Mayor, what we looked at is square footage as the measure, and I know that the quality level of the exterior and stuff like that, a little bit different. But I had no additional information at this point that would tell me that we're enhancing the capacity in an extended way with this particular building. There may have been further adjustments I could have made, but I just didn't get at this particular point anything insightful that would cause me to change the manner in which, we quite often make these allocations. But on the other side, I mean, as I say, that particular service, we could triple the amount of the charge.
Its cost is significant, not size.
Yeah,
Even if we were to look at the square footage costs of a new building versus what's out there we
Yes.
have today, it's quite different, quite different.
yes. Your 10,000 square feet is roughly running at a little over $300 a square foot, including land and et cetera. And we've got the existing ones, in at roughly $300 a square foot. We valued the Harwood, which is 5,600 square feet. We valued it at $334 a square foot, including land. And we valued the Boodley. So we basically have costed them at a very similar replacement cost as what you would be constructing. But you're replacing, you've got 5,600 square feet and 4,700 square feet. So we're kind of in the same magnitude. You're knocking down, this, if I understand it correctly, was to replace two existing buildings. And I haven't got anything more insightful and it's not the cost per square foot that we're out of whack, it's the sizing of the two buildings, and I'm not quite sure how that new building enhances the capacity. I've got no other guidance.
It actually wouldn't. The square footage, the combined total of the square footage of the two halls would actually be larger than the total square footage of a new single hall. And don't get any other ideas in your head, guys.
Yeah, and so we've got a minor amount in there for the station. We've got a $730,000 provision for a new vehicle, which would be a fully equipped, say, pumper.
Yep.
We could, in that particular area, we could add, a provision for additional future space or something, or a provision for additional vehicle. We could certainly enhance the dollar value for fire service.
We may very well need to do that.
I agree.
Staying with what's going to be my last question, I think, Gary,
Scott,
sorry.
before you ask your last question,
Mine's
Pat, is
fire.
this one related to
Yes,
the
fire.
topic we're on, Pat? Then we'll let Pat butt in, if that's okay, Scott?
Yep.
Again, so they understand the developer charge purpose. If this theoretical building, two buildings were changed into one building, the question, we're allowed to do that under development charges if what we have is servicing our current people? So is new growth actually covering that?
We have a minor attribution of that new building in here right now.
So just a very small, so it's
Very
not.
small.
It's very small.
It's not huge. If you can include, say, renovation costs of an existing building type of thing, if the test is always, how does that expand the capacity to provide the service? Like you're expanding capacity. It's always the test. So if you've got a library, for example, and the basement is dead storage downstairs, but you want to spend money to make it into programmable space, fine. There you can say, well, I'm expanding the capacity to provide the service because I'm either going to have, additional teaching, I'm going to have, different programs. You'd be able to say, oh yeah, I can see how that expenditure. And this one here, as I say, we're knocking down two buildings. I haven't got anything that really gives me any guidance that I'm replacing these two with something of similar size. And I haven't got a lot that tells me, oh yeah, but we're enhancing the capacity as a result. And I'm not, through the discussions, I haven't got that.
I would love to be able to use development charges. I just was trying to understand if we could. And the same with the truck, adding a truck we would be able to charge for, but
Yes.
replacing a truck, we would not.
Maybe. If
Oh.
you, let's say you had a tanker, and you wanted to replace, and the tanker is $200,000, you wanted to replace it with a pumper tanker, $700,000, then $500,000 of that truck, I could fund by development charges. Because it's now that you're expanding the utility of that vehicle from just being a tanker to now a pumper tanker, which gives you greater capacity to fight fires.
So then we can legitimize raising the cost for fire. is what
Yes.
you- Like you were saying, we could up to triple it, but when you're actually looking at how we're justifying it, we do have justification.
We could enhance, it's when you go to spend it, the test is, what are you spending it on? So this area could be enhanced. But based on the information I have right now, we did make a provision for one additional vehicle, and we've got a minor attribution towards the new building.
That may or may not exist. Got it.
But we can make a provision for additional space, make a provision for more vehicles, and enhance that area.
Okay, Pat?
I'm good for fire.
Last question. Although it's got an A and a B part. It's under the comparison chart again for non-residential,
Yes.
Gary. And it's dealing with roads related to a highway, services related to a highway. The current's 39 cents. The calculated potential future's 317. So you've got an 8-fold increase. Bouncing down lower on the chart where you've got general government engineering studies, present is 2 cents and going to 48 cents, which means, it's a 24-fold, 25-fold increase, which means substantial percentages of increase here, like right off the chart sort of thing. What's in your information that makes us feel comfortable with those substantial increases?
I can't speak to the calculations that were done before. What I can speak to is that, there is, looking at growth, we have looked at historic growth levels on the non-residential side. We've made provision for growth to occur on that side, and we've applied the methodology. I can't recall off the top of my head whether the reduction was directed by council. Maybe it was calculated at $5 and council decided to put in 60 some odd cents, or whether that was the methodology where they completely different consultant, different methodology. But this methodology is how we've applied it, and been through the OMB myself over 30 times. And it's an accepted method on how we've attributed those costs. We've taken a look at residential growth, non-residential growth, and we've attributed basically 20% of the cost of the roads towards non-residential growth.
And that's based on a municipal average, or based on our municipal organization?
Your information, your.
20%?
Yep,
Whoa.
yep.
That one leaves me with questions, but I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm just going to leave it, Bill, thanks.
This,
Paul, go ahead.
I can
Yes,
add to that. The last development charge study, I believe, did not identify any sort of consulting fees for any studies going forward. It wasn't, I'm not sure if it wasn't known that 90% of those fees were able to be paid for any of the studies. I'm not sure whether it was known that they could be paid for that, but we have identified a number of studies going forward, knowing that 90% of all of those studies, development charge studies, water rate studies, all that sort of thing, could be paid through development charges. We've identified them, and we have built that in to the development charges. So I think that that would provide for a significant increase in that charge.
Related to.
Yes, Pat, related to?
So saying that, those different studies that are currently budgeted in as they come out, what we would see coming out of, 90% of them coming out of budget, right? Like it will come out of development charges instead, correct?
In the capital budget going forward, when you have the sources of funding, yes, it would be 90% coming out of development charges for those studies.
Okay, and that, would that include things like the road study? Roads needs?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can fund the roads need study out of that. We didn't have that information when we budgeted in 2019. Therefore, the budget for 2019, as we apply that budget, we will see a great reduction in the amount of use of our regular reserves and an increase in the reserve funds from the development charges in 2019.
Considering the number of studies that we're required to do, if this is the place to get the money, that makes me happy.
Mark?
Just a question on some of those study charges and so forth. Is that something new? Like, is that new in the last few years? Because, I mean, we've always looked for adding more charges if we could get them in the past.
No, studies have been defined as eligible costs since, it's been very clear since 1997. The Act made it very clear that any of the studies are eligible. With the changes, right now, there's 10% deduction on on non-hard services. So if you're doing a road study, if you're doing parks, recreation, you get to the end, knock off an extra 10%. Remember, I went through that, the methodology. If you read in there, for soft services, knock off an extra 10%. When we go to this new regime, there's no more knocking off the 10%. So the development charge study, which is one that has that 10% knockoff, goes to 100%. Is fully, this study would be fully funded by DCs. Any of the eligible services would then be fully funded. When you go over to the CBC, right now it doesn't look like there's any of that 10% deduction. But they are continuing with not being able to put in the town hall, not being able to put in, the ineligible services. But it looks like there's no more of that service standard measurement, there's no more of that 10% deduction.
I'd just like to make one last comment on this. I can remember when we started looking at development charges a number of years ago, and we were always one of the higher municipalities within our county as far as development charges, other than the Cobourg and Port Hope. As far as rural ones, we were on the higher end. And I think we were doing a lot of comparisons as far as where we should be and how much we should charge by what the other municipalities were charging, because there's actually some that were charging nothing, very next to nothing. So I think that's why sometimes our rates are on the lower end rather than on the, where they should be. I shouldn't say on the higher end, but where they should be. And right now, I think we're playing catch up, and I think it's good to see that we are catching up in a lot of areas, perhaps that we weren't even aware that we should be charging on. So it's good to see that. Thank you.
All right, most of the questions I had, I'm down to one that hasn't been asked. It's regards to policing, and it's just for clarification that we're down to 0. I'm assuming that, or I shouldn't say assuming, I'm asking, is that because we don't have detachment here? We don't pay for vehicles, we don't pay for boats, we don't pay for skidoos, ATVs, any kind of equipment for police? That's why we're at 0?
I think, I'm just double checking on the service standard. I think it's because we have included police in many other jurisdictions, even though it's a contracted service with the OPP. So we can quite often be able to do, they want a community room or a detachment or something, and so that we can normally calculate. Right now, through the process, there was nothing that was identified as a capital need, so we didn't include anything. But it could be one of those areas. We could go back and take a look and make a provision so that at least you're collecting money, because at some point, all of a sudden, bingo, you need to provide some space. So it's something that could be considered.
All right, thank you. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm breaking point of order here, but this is something we're expected to pass today. So we have staff in the room who are directly impacted by this, and I don't know if I'm breaking a point of order, if I could ask if there are comments, questions, suggestions from the staff who are present, that we'd rather hear them now than find out tomorrow after we passed a bylaw that we'd overlooked something or done something that we shouldn't have done or whatever. So is that fair? Is it fair to me to involve staff, or am I out of order? Council, how do you feel about it?
If staff have an opportunity to help us through this process to make it simpler and better for them to use, then I would support them having that opportunity, whether it be now, in the past, or in the future.
I don't have a problem with staff having some input. I would have been happier if we had had Trevor in the room too, since he's hit a fairly big cut. And he wasn't here a few minutes ago. I don't know if he's in the building somewhere.
No, he's busy.
Okay. Before you do that, I have two just general questions. Very general. Did I hear correctly that this new one would be indexed so that each year it will go up ever so slightly?
Yes, we would put in, and that it would be automatic. And it's a StatsCan construction cost index, and what it tracks is the change in tender prices. So from one year to the next, you see your roads tenders going up by 5%. In theory, that's taken into account when StatsCan do their calculations, those type of adjustments. So it's trying to track tender price changes.
Okay, and my second question is, when you talked about how, like with Scott's amending about the demolition derelict, et cetera, you said it could be amended at any time. The actual amount that we're asking can also be amended at any time? Like when we're talking about
Yes.
we're concerned that fire is low, I'm very concerned that library and rec are so much lower, even though I understand why general government is higher. Do we need to get those numbers more accurate today?
I can, if you want the only thing I would suggest is, the rule of thumb is if you're going to increase the charge, we probably need a second public meeting. So you would pass the bylaw, and then we would just do an addendum, as we did before, and suggest these increases. So within 2 months, we'd have the charge up, if you wanted to double the amount for fire, I could do that. I can get you 16% more on the library. That's about it.
Even 10 would make me happy.
Parks and Recreation, I can, just give me a second, I can tell you what adjustments there, if you want us to max out on the services.
I just feel, as Mark said, we've been playing catch-up a long time. So if there's places where we should be looking at realistic increases, then now's the time to do it.
I can increase indoor rec 8 times.
Okay, I don't think maybe they're going to go that high, but
So the charge that's there, I mean, we could increase it. If that's something that you would like us to do, as I say, I would probably suggest pass the bylaw, because if we're going to increase the charge, I can, working with Paul, I can come back and say the maximum quantum for all these different services could be this. And this is what we've included right now. Where would you like to be? And then from that direction, we'll issue an addendum report, and basically within 2 months, you'll have an increased charge.
then my suggestion might be, Mr. Mayor, that rather than have staff speak out today, we look at the charges that they are and have them bring forward where they think it's an issue for the departments that we're talking about being lower.
It may not simply be charges that they wish to address, though.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of other things in the
I don't
bylaw.
have any issue with,
They have to work with it, so.
And
So
through you,
I-
Mr. Mayor, on a couple of these items, such as trying to work a definition of demolition, I would suggest that would be an opportunity for us to vet that a little bit more and put it in the next addendum. So if we're going to put it in, maybe get it right. Have an opportunity to talk with all the appropriate staff, and then get that in. I could make a suggestion right now, and we could further refine it. It's your choice.
We have about a 4 to 5 year interval to get the bylaw right. We're sitting here with items that we would like reviewed and possibly altered. To get to that, it would seem as though we have to pass a bylaw that we're not necessarily all happy with, but it does provide us the opportunity to do anything as far as definitions, trigger points, fees. Like, it's not limited to just fees as far as our tweaking is concerned. Is that correct?
That's what I'm suggesting. Between now, if we lock down the bylaw, and within 2 months, we'll modify it to pick up all of the suggested adjustments.
And any that staff may bring forward that we as council members are laymen, actually, compared to staff. I mean, there may be some excellent points from our staff that haven't been brought forward yet. That would provide an opportunity for that as well.
Yes. I think, and what I would suggest is perhaps we have a little bit of a workshop, or another dialogue just like this. And we come back with a list of all these different items and suggested definitions, et cetera. We could turn that around very shortly. And then from your direction, put it into an addendum bylaw and get the process moving.
I appreciate that, Gary, but I'd like to add a little bit to that. Very shortly isn't important to me as very accurately is to me.
Absolutely. My suggestion is, I'm thinking that within a week or two, we could get that input. I could even I've got all 212 bylaws across Ontario. It'll give me a chance to research and see if I can find others on their definition of demolition. Maybe somebody else has been creative already. That'll give me a chance to find things like that.
Could someone, I'm assuming our staff want this, and I don't know, I've not had any conversations with them on this topic, but the indexing component where we collect a given development charge at the time of severance, and it continues to grow from an indexing point of view. Could you have examples or bring forward examples of other municipalities, how the staff deal with that effectively? And maybe our own treasury staff already know that. Tracking development fees, indexing development fees, and getting the right number 20 years later for the bump up development fee is not something that I want to work on. And I assume I'm not alone with that. Is there a process there that could be shared with our staff to keep it as simple and as logical and as easy as possible? Whether that be you as a consultant or whether that be our own Treasury Department or whoever.
Could you ask the question again? That was very broad.
Okay, is there an opportunity to keep the tracking of development fees for our staff simple, considering they're now going to be indexed, and they're an ever-increasing fee? I mean, obviously, we're looking at something today different than we were 5 years ago. So, I mean, it's a process. Is there a process that you know of to make it work effectively? Because when you go to our vault to pull a severance file from 1989 and then try to get it to an index development fee to get the top up, it's horrible for staff.
Okay, so the indexing is easy. We send that, we track it. I give, through the treasurer, the indexing amount.
On an annual basis?
Annual
during the next
basis.
5 years?
Yes.
Great information. I don't know those types of things.
That's part of our aftercare. He just sends an email, we send it, we track it. So it's easier than for us to do it, rather than them trying to find this stuff. So
If you have any little bits of information like that that can be shared, I would appreciate you doing that.
Yep. We do, and
Okay.
and Paul's very good. I've worked with Paul for a number of years. He's very good at, just giving a quick phone call. Once again, if it's something I can answer, on the phone, we don't bill and stuff like that. If I need to put paper to pen or do stuff, and it's going to take me an hour, maybe I'd charge a little bit. But most of the time, most of the stuff, the aftercare is part of our fee.
Okay, so I have opened this up to staff, and I'm getting the impression that council is okay with going through this, and the clerk hasn't stepped on my foot or anything, so we're going to open it up. If there's any members of staff who have,
Before we just open it to staff, though, I think we should also give staff an opportunity to go back and have second thoughts on this and come back, as you've mentioned, within that, whether you have a workshop and so forth with staff, so that they're not just put on the spot today. I mean, it's awful hard to come up with,
yeah,
their
and
thoughts
I'm not
today.
trying to put them on the spot at all, but I thought if they had a burning question or some real concern that we should know about today, that they have a chance to bring it forward.
Okay.
So that's fine. I'm not trying to press anybody out there to push anybody, so is there anyone who has anything? No.
Mayor Kane, I think there was one comment the building inspector had, they wanted to raise as well, so.
Okay.
I like the idea.
Sorry, Tim, we're going to have to bring you up to a microphone because this is all being recorded, and they won't be able to hear you otherwise on the video, on the audio, I'm sorry.
I think the workshop could help well. My question was relating to demolition and existing foundations that have been demolished with conversation of being able to build again their home without paying development charges. So common practice, would that change? I think a lot of those sorts of questions can be identified in the workshop if it's not today. But yeah, a number of processing questions, tracking was one. Again, clarification for staff, at least our front line, I think is a crucial component. And we look at that as an addendum, that would be fine on my end.
Mr. Scanlon's shaking his head affirmatively, so.
Yeah. So, thank you
So-
for asking us as well.
Anyone else on staff? Yes, thanks, Sandra.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. I do have to admit that I haven't been able to fully read this report and comprehend it, so maybe some of my answers are there, and perhaps my answers would be better addressed at the workshop. Again, the trigger date is going to be very important. If somebody does have a fire, for example, and it takes a while for the fire marshal and insurance to get itself squared away, would that 5-year date be able to be extended through special request? Again, I'm not looking for answers today, but something to be discussed. Would something like a fire or even a change in use, the 5-year credit, would that impact the cessation of use as defined, or actually not defined, in planning realm? It's difficult for somebody to reestablish a non-conforming use or a use that is not legal if it's been ceased for a period, but that period of time has never been legally defined to the best of my knowledge. So I'm wondering what kind of impact something like this might have. And just as a point of information, a little bit lighthearted, there was a webinar that the planners were privy to about a week ago. I was not aware of it for whatever reason, but the other planners in the county were aware of it for Bill 108. And one of the things that came back in the email string was the interest rate on development charges and community benefit charges. And since it wasn't capped, the planners are quite happy with 100% interest. Yes, thank you.
Sure they would be. But if you have those questions written, Sandra, would it be of advantage to give them to Mr. Scanlon? Or do you think you just want to hold them till the workshop? Or would you like them ahead of time?
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think we've taken notes of the comments of council, so we'll come back and summarize those. And absolutely, as I say, what I'll do is, one of the things is what we've got in here, and if we wanted to max out the charge, what would that be? And that gives you some insight. Some of the questions on demolition and stuff, as I say, I've got over 200 bylaws. I'm going to do some research and see if I can find some other definitions that others are using that might be, why reinvent the wheel? Maybe there's something there that would be very helpful. And then any other comments to staff, more than happy to receive them. And as I said, we'll bring it all back together in a detailed listing. And we'll, if you want to have a conversation such as this, or we call it a workshop or whatever, we can do that.
Last chance, council. Pat?
I like the idea of a workshop, and one thing that didn't come up was, at the public meeting, was there anything that was brought forward that didn't get addressed? Like in your development charge bylaw?
I would say it was somewhat of a limited turnout.
Okay, so
So
we've
there
removed-
wasn't anything that I didn't address.
Okay, so
How's
there's
that?
not anything that came forward, we went, oh no, we need to know that the public's concerned about this.
Correct.
Thanks very much.
I showed up and doubled the crowd, Pat. Larry,
I have
did you
that
something
effect on
so-
people, so.
I just thought that we better make a recommendation that there still is no regulations for this. And that won't be down until it's approved, correct?
Sorry?
The regulations still haven't been determined.
What's in place right now is the Development Charges Act that's been in place, subject to the changes through Bill 73, but the act is in place. The regulations will kick in, whatever they finally are, probably November. So if we want to make the changes, we have to probably get this addendum bylaw passed by early October. So we need to, that's why I say very quickly, come back, issue the addendum, because we got to get that 60 days going, and basically get it in place before the province sits again in mid-October.
Who's working on that? Are you doing that in consultation with our staff?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
We'll set a date and be back to you shortly.
All right. Did we make, just when I thought we had made it.
We have really, I just wanted to provide summary to you, Mr. Mayor. And that is, we provided the background supporting information through Watson Associates back on May 3rd and at the council on May 6th. Had a public meeting in June. We know we need to have this meeting today to pass the bylaw, to get it in place, because the system we have in place right now is working. We just want this to be updated and brought into sort of today's new numbers. And we've identified through today the tracking of fees, indexing, the fire demolition issues, some increase to fees. And these are all the mechanical issues that we can address through a workshop and make sure that the tweaks do in fact improve upon the final bylaw. So I think we're at a point where we'll have a bylaw in place, we'll be able to charge development fees, and we'll be able to deal with some of these special circumstances or special issues that we want to through a future workshop, through future discussion. So thank you for that.
Anyone else? All right. We're moving on. 6.2, report CD 2019-17, subdivision agreement with Neil Dennis Enterprises Limited. Thank you. Gary? So we have recommendation. So is someone going to come forward with this, or you're going to do it, Kate? Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So, we have a subdivision proposed in Bewdley's, just on the north side of Lake Street. It's a small, limited to 6-lot subdivision. And we're at a point now where we're ready to... So it's a 6-lot subdivision in the village of Bewdley. We're at a point now where we're ready to enter into the agreement with the developer. And there are a few other submissions that they have to make before the approval authority can actually register the M-plan and register the subdivision agreement. But today we're looking at authorization from council to authorize the mayor and clerk to sign and execute the subdivision agreement, and any other documents associated with the registration of the agreement. And there's always acknowledgement and directions that have to be signed and other documents. So we're looking for that authorization.
Any discussion? All right. We'll move to bylaws. 7.1.
Report.
Yeah, we need to we need to approve the report 6.2, I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
That's why your hand was up, Pat, right? Moved by Pat, seconded by Mark, that we accept this presentation. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Now bylaws, 7.1. That written somewhere in here. So bylaw read development charges bylaw, 2019-46. Need a mover and a seconder. If I can get to, sorry. Okay, mover by Pat. Second. I guess we need to read it out first, don't we? Is it in here? So we just looking for mover to second then for bylaw 2019-46. We are development charges bylaw, which is, we all have it in our package. So it's given a first, second, and third reading this 4th day of July 2019. Pat's generously offered to move this forward. Mark's going to second. Any discussion? Had enough, I hope.
It comes with the understanding that we'll be reviewing it
Yep.
almost immediately.
Yes, that's come forward. Okay, all in favor? Carried. And then the bylaw requested by our clerk, bylaw 2019-47, read the Neil Dennis subdivision. Again, we need to have a first, second, and third reading this 4th day of July 2019. We need a mover, Scott, and a seconder. Thanks, Mark. Discussion? All in favor? Carried. Any questions from the media on agenda items only? No. Thank you. Thank you. We have no closed. We have a confirmatory bylaw. Is it in here somewhere, Kate?
There.
Bylaw 2019-48 to confirm the proceedings of today's special meeting of council. Moved by Pat, seconded by Larry. Ah, boy, Larry, thank you. All in favor? Carried. Motion for adjournment. Moved by Scott, seconded Pat. All in favor? Carried. Thank you
He's been awake lately.
for getting us through that.
He's been awake and worried.
Yes.